kb Mission Ridge, Milne Bay, Papua New Guinea, 0317, August 31st, 1942. The rain was not a sound, it was the world. It was a constant, deafening roar that hammered the helmets of the men from the 2 to 12th Battalion. It turned the black volcanic soil of the Mission Ridge into a sucking, knee-deep morass that smelled of rotten vegetation and despair. Lieutenant Jack "Rowdy" Rowlands lay flat on a saturated piece of Hessian sacking, his body screaming from the damp cold. He pressed his face against the slick wooden stock of his rifle, the metal chilling his cheekbone. He stared into an impenetrable wall of black. Beside him, Sergeant Bluey Barnes breathed in shallow, controlled puffs, his eyes wide, fixed on the same patch of nothing. "They're coming, sir," Bluey whispered, his voice barely a vibration in the deluge. Rowlands didn't need to be told. He could feel it. The jungle, usually a cacophony of insects and dripping water, had fallen silent. The rain was the only sound, but beneath it, there was a new tension, a new pressure in the air. He held a flare pistol in his left hand, the checkered grip slick with mud. His thumb rested on the release. "Wait for it," Rowlands breathed, the words tasting of mud. "Wait for it." Then it came. It wasn't a shout. It was a low, guttural chanting, a rising chorus from hundreds of throats, masked by the downpour. Uminohe, uminohe, the sound of scraping metal, the sucking plop of hundreds of boots pulling free of the mire. "Sir, they're close," a young private whimpered from a weapons pit 5 yards away. "I can smell them." "Quiet," Bluey hissed. "Hold your nerve." The chanting grew louder, the cadence speeding up, rising in pitch until it broke into a series of sharp, terrifying shouts. A wave of humanity was surging up the slope toward them, invisible in the pre-dawn blackness and the tropical storm. Every man in Rowlands's platoon had his finger on the trigger. Every instinct, every ounce of training screamed at them to open fire, to fill the darkness with lead, to erect a wall of muzzle flashes against the unseen, oncoming tide. Jack Rowlands pressed his thumb harder onto the flare gun's catch. His entire body vibrated with the tension of not acting. His plan, his desperate gamble, hinged on this single agonizing moment of restraint. "Not yet," he whispered to himself, the rain washing the words from his lips. "Not yet." The noise was almost on top of them. He could hear them breathing. To understand the terror on that ridge, one must understand Milne Bay. By August 1942, the war in the Pacific was a drumbeat of Allied disasters. The Empire of Japan had seemed unstoppable, a force of nature that had swept through Hong Kong, Malaya, Singapore, and the Dutch East Indies. The Japanese soldier, particularly the Kaigun Rikusentai, the Special Naval Landing Forces, was considered a superhuman jungle warrior, an invincible phantom who lived on rice, fought with suicidal bravery, and never ever surrendered. Now, they had landed here, at the far eastern tip of Papua New Guinea. Their target, Milne Bay. The bay was a 20-mile-long, 8-mile-wide inlet of deep water, a perfect natural harbor. But the prize was not the harbor. It was the land. Allied engineers, primarily American, were carving 3 vital airstrips from the swampy, coconut palm-choked flats at the head of the bay. From these strips, RAF Kitty Hawks and Hudsons could strike the Japanese fortress at Rabaul. They were the key to controlling the Coral Sea and the entire New Guinea campaign. The Japanese knew this. Their plan, Operation RE, was to land their elite forces, sweep aside the soft Australian militia, capture the airfields in days, and turn the Allies' new forward base into their own. The problem was the terrain. It was not jungle. It was a primeval swamp. The flat, narrow coastal strip was a morass of sago and mangrove, crisscrossed by creeks and rivers that swelled into torrents with the daily downpours. The rain was relentless, measuring not in inches, but in feet. The mud was a living entity, a thick, black, adhesive ooze that pulled boots off feet, bogged trucks to their axles, and made every movement a Herculean effort. It was a place where weapons rusted in hours, uniforms rotted off men's backs, and malaria was a more constant enemy than the Japanese. Into this watery hell, the Japanese had thrust 2,000 elite Marines. Facing them were the men of the Australian 7th Brigade, the 61st and 210th Battalions, and the 18th Brigade, which included Rowlands's 212th Battalion. These were not untested militia. The 18th Brigade were diggers, hardened veterans recently returned from the deserts of Tobruk and the bitter fighting in Syria. But this wasn't the desert. This was a new kind of war. And for the first 3 days, the Japanese proved they were its masters. KB Mission Area, 23 Or, August 28, 1942. The first clashes were a nightmare. The Japanese moved at night. They didn't use the muddy, trackless roads. They slipped through the dense jungle on the inland side of the airfields, bypassing strong points. They used the rain as cover, their movements masked by the endless deluge. Australian doctrine was standard: set up listening posts, string tripwires for flares, and open fire at the first sign of contact. This doctrine was failing, catastrophically. A nervous Australian machine gunner, peering into the claustrophobic black, would see a shadow move. He'd open fire. The stream of tracers would instantly betray his position. The Japanese, who had sent that shadow forward as bait, would use the muzzle flash as a target. Mortars would rain down. A separate team of infiltrators, silent as ghosts, would have already slipped around the flank, cutting telephone wires and striking the command post with grenades and bayonets. On the night of August 27th, the Japanese hit the 61st Battalion hard, scattering them and pushing forward. On the 28th, they slammed into the 210th Battalion near the No. 2 airstrip. "They're ghosts, sir," a young corporal, his face smeared with mud and streaked with tears, reported to his company commander. "We shoot at shadows and they just appear behind us." "They're in the trees. They're in the bloody mud." The RAF Kitty Hawks of 75 and 76 squadrons provided heroic support during the day, strafing the Japanese positions relentlessly, their 50 caliber rounds tearing through the palm groves. But at night, the airfields belonged to the pilots. The ground belonged to the mud and the Japanese. By August 30th, the Australians had been pushed back, past the No. 3 strip, to a new defensive line. The line's anchor was a small rise of ground occupied by the ramshackle buildings of the KB mission. Here, the 212th Battalion, supported by elements of the 209th, dug in for a final stand. The Japanese, sensing victory, gathered for one more push to break the Australian line and seize the main airfield. Frustration in the Australian command dugout was thick enough to cut. "Our tactics are wrong." Lieutenant Colonel Arthur Starr, CO of the 212th, growled, running a hand over his exhausted, stubbled face. "We are letting them dictate the fight. They hit us, we fire, they pinpoint us, they infiltrate. Every time, we're fighting their way." The men were exhausted, soaked to the bone, and spooked. The myth of the invincible jungle warrior was holding. They were fighting shadows, and the shadows were winning. Lieutenant Jack Rowlands was not an academic soldier. He was a cattleman from the Queensland backcountry. His mind was not shaped by Sandhurst or Duntroon, but by the unforgiving logic of the bush. He thought in terms of fences, clearings, and managing predators. He had spent years setting traps for dingoes and foxes, vermin that were clever, nocturnal, and lethal to his livestock. He was quiet, a man who watched more than he spoke. He had seen combat in Syria, where his platoon had been pinned down by Vichy French machine guns. He had learned a brutal lesson there. A single, well-sighted gun could stop 100 men, but 2 interlocking guns could annihilate them. On the afternoon of August 30th, Rowlands sat on an ammunition box, ostensibly cleaning his rifle, but really, he was watching. He was studying the ground his men had to defend. The KB mission sat on a low ridge. In front of it, the ground sloped away for about 300 yards before dissolving back into the dense jungle and swamp. This slope was not clean. It was a mess of felled trees, bomb craters, and shell-torn stumps from the previous day's fighting. He watched a Japanese patrol, 3 men, emerge from the jungle's edge, 400 yards out. They were testing the line. A nervous private from another platoon, 50 yards to Rowlands' left, fired a single shot. The .303 round cracked over the water. Rowlands watched the Japanese patrol. They didn't panic. They didn't run back. They instantly melted. 2 vanished into the undergrowth to the left, the other to the right. They had used the shot as a beacon. They now knew exactly where that Australian rifleman was. In 10 minutes, a mortar round would likely land on that very spot. "We're doing it all wrong," Roland said, so quietly Sergeant Bluey Barnes barely heard him. Doing what wrong, sir? That, Roland said, nodding at the rifle pit. We're telling them where we are. We're swatting at them one by one. You don't hunt dingoes that way, Bluey. You don't scatter bait all over the station. You build one good, strong trap. You build a yard, leave the gate open, and you put all the bait inside it. You let them come in, and then you shut the gate. Bluey frowned. I'm not following, Rowdy. Roland stood up and walked to the edge of his trench, ignoring the risk of snipers. He pointed down the slope. They want us to shoot. They rely on us shooting. It's how they find us. It's how they maneuver. He turned, his eyes electric. So, we don't shoot. Bluey's frown deepened. Sir, they're going to charge us tonight. Everyone knows it. If we don't shoot? Not ever, Bluey. Just not yet. Rollins grabbed his sergeant's arm. We let them come. We let them think the ridge is empty. We let them come all the way up the slope, right into the clearing. We let them mass for their final charge, right there. He pointed to a relatively flat, open patch of mud 50 yards in front of the mission buildings. We let them get close enough to throw rocks at, Rollins continued, his voice low and intense. And then, we shut the gate. We hit them not with one rifle, but with everything. Every Vickers, every Bren, every rifle, every grenade, all at once. No shadows to hunt. No muzzle flashes to pinpoint. Just a wall. A machine. The idea was terrifying. It required supreme, almost inhuman discipline. It meant letting an enemy that specialized in close-quarters combat get dangerously close. It was a gamble on the nerve of his men versus the momentum of the Japanese charge. Rollins took his idea to his company commander, who, wary of the young lieutenant's intensity, kicked it up to Lieutenant Colonel Starr. They met in the command dugout, a dripping, foul-smelling hole dug beneath the mission house floor. The air was thick with tobacco smoke and the smell of wet earth. Starr listened, his face an unreadable mask, as Rollins laid out his plan. And that's the key, sir, Rollins finished, jabbing a muddy finger at a crude map sketched on a signal pad. We hold all fire. No one fires until my flare goes up. We let them concentrate right here. We let them believe they've broken through. A major from the 2/9th, attached as support, scoffed. Hold fire? Lieutenant, these are Rikusentai. They'll have bayonets in your men's guts before your flare even pops. It's suicide. It's suicide to keep doing what we're doing, Rollins countered, his respect for rank evaporating in his conviction. We're losing men every night to infiltration. They're cutting us to pieces. This way, we fight on our ground. On ground we've chosen. And what if they don't come up the middle? The major asked. What if they flank you? They always come up the middle in their final push, sir, Rollins insisted. They believe their spirit is superior. They want the direct charge. We're just inviting them to the party. Colonel Starr looked at Rollins, then at the map. He was a hardened commander, and he knew his Australian troops. They were notorious for their lack of proper parade ground discipline, but they possessed a different, more stubborn kind. They had a cussed, independent arrogance. If they understood the reason for an order, they would follow it to hell and back. You're asking me to bet the entire defensive line on the trigger discipline of your platoon, Starr said flatly. I'm asking you to trust my men, sir, Rollins said, and I'm asking you to give me more guns. I want the Vickers from C Company, both of them, and I want the 2/9th's Brens positioned on the flanks. There was a long, heavy silence. The dugout filled with the sound of rain drumming on the corrugated iron roof above. All right, Lieutenant, Starr said, making his decision. You're building the yard, you're in charge of the gate. But God help you, and us, if your men fire too soon, or too late. Starr turned to the other officers. You heard him. Absolute fire control. No one, and I mean no one, fires a single round until Rollins' flare is in the air. Pass it down the line. This is it. Rollins didn't have steel or welding torches. His invention was built of mud, ammunition boxes, sandbags, and sight lines. He and Bluey Barnes spent the entire afternoon of August 30th in the pouring rain, building their trap. The work was agonizing. The prototype was a machine designed for one purpose, and it had to be perfect. "The number 1 Vickers," Rollins directed, pointing to a ruined native hut on the left flank of the ridge. "Get it in there. I want it firing across our front, not at it. It should be aimed at the right-hand edge of the clearing, fixed line." He had 2 of the mighty 303 Vickers heavy machine guns, water-cooled and belt-fed. They were weapons of defense, capable of firing 500 rounds a minute. Normally, they were used for long-range, harassing fire. Rollins was planning to use them at point-blank range. "Bluey, take the number 2 Vickers, put it on the far right, aim it back across, at the left edge of the clearing. I want their fields of fire to cross right in the middle, about waist-high." "An X, sir," Bluey said, the grim logic dawning on him. "A bloody X of lead." "Exactly. They'll be caught in a crossfire. They won't know which way to turn." Next, he sighted the Brens, the lighter, magazine-fed machine guns. They were placed in staggered pits, slightly forward of the main line. Their job was not to sweep, but to plug the gaps in the Vickers' fire. Finally, he walked his own platoon's rifle pits. He spoke to every man. He didn't shout. He knelt in the mud beside them. "Listen to me, lads," he said to a young private named Harris, who was shaking so hard he could barely hold his mug of tea. "They are coming tonight, and they will come on yelling, and it will be terrifying. And you will want to shoot, but you will not. You will not fire when you see them. You will not fire when you hear them. You will not fire until you see my flare go up. It will be a green flare. When it goes up, you fire. You fire at the man in front of you, you work your bolt, and you fire again. Do you understand me, Harris?" Yes, sir. This isn't a fight. This is a job. We're going to let them walk into the parlor, and we're going to be very, very rude hosts. Wait for the flare." He repeated this, man by man, down the entire line. He checked every sight line. He had men clear small patches of brush, not for a wide field of fire, but to channel the attackers, to subtly guide them into the 300-yard wide, 100-yard deep kill zone he had designated. By dusk, the trap was set. The machine was assembled. It was a network of interlocking guns, all sighted on a single empty patch of mud. All it needed was the nerve of the men to wait. As night fell, the rain returned with biblical fury. KB Mission Ridge, EO 130, August 31st, 1942. The first test came an hour after midnight. It was a probe, just as Rollins had seen that afternoon. A section of Japanese soldiers, perhaps 5 or 6 men, crept out of the jungle line. They moved in staggered formation, ghosting from crater to crater, moving up the slope. Rollins lay behind his small parapet, his binoculars pressed to his eyes, the lenses fogging instantly. He wiped them on his sleeve. The patrol was 150 yards out, then 100. They were in the zone. Rollins could feel the tension in his platoon like a physical wire being stretched to its breaking point. He could hear Private Harris's breathing, a fast, ragged gasp. "Easy, lad," Bluey whispered from the next pit. "Easy." The Japanese patrol stopped. They crouched in the mud, listening. They were clearly confused. There were no nervous shots, no tripwires, no flares. The ridge in front of them was dark, silent save for the roar of the rain. They must have assumed the Australians had retreated, that the position was abandoned or held only by a skeleton crew. One of the patrol members stood up, silhouetted for a moment against the slightly less black sky. He waved his arm in an all-clear motion toward the jungle behind him. Rollins felt a surge of cold adrenaline. They took the bait. The patrol leader shouted something back to the main body, and the small group trotted forward another 20 yards. They were now less than 80 yards from the Australian line. They paused, then, satisfied, they turned and melted back into the darkness. The test was a success. The silence had worked. The Japanese believed the ridge was undefended. They were reporting back, telling their commander that the final assault would be a simple charge into an empty position. Rollins let out a breath he didn't know he was holding. His hands were shaking. "All right, Bluey," he said over the field telephone to the Vickers pit. "They're gone. They're telling their mates the kettle's on." "Good on 'em," Bluey's voice crackled back. "We'll boil the billy for 'em." Now, there was nothing to do but wait. The silence stretched. 1 hour, then 2. The rain intensified. The air grew heavy, pregnant with a terrible, gathering violence. KB Mission Ridge, 0317, August 31st, 1942. It began with the chanting, Umi no Hei. Then the full-throated shouts, Banzai! It was not a patrol. It was a wave. Hundreds of men, the elite 5th Rikusentai, burst from the tree line. They came on at a run, officers leading with drawn swords, men holding their rifles with fixed bayonets at their hips. This was the moment. Wait for it, Rollins whispered, his own voice shaking. The first wave of attackers hit the 300-yard mark. They were charging with abandon, believing the position to be empty. Sir, yelled Private Harris, his voice cracking. There so many. Hold, Rollins roared, his voice tearing through the rain. Hold the line. The Japanese charged up the slope. 200 yards. They were in the cleared area. 150 yards. They were a single-massed body of men, charging into the center of the trap. Rollins could see the glint of their bayonets, the pale ovals of their faces. They were 100 yards out. 70. 50. They were so close he could hear the slap of their feet in the mud over the storm. Now, Jack Rollins raised the flare pistol, pointed it at the sky, and pulled the trigger. A loud thump and a streak of green light tore into the black sky. The flare burst, casting a hideous, brilliant green-white light over the entire scene. It illuminated a sea of charging men. For one paralyzed microsecond, the Japanese soldiers looked up, their faces a mixture of confusion and fanaticism, their mouths open in mid-shout. They were caught perfectly in the center of the X. Open fire! Roland screamed. The world ended. The two Vickers guns opened up simultaneously. They didn't sound like guns. They sounded like giant shears, a deafening mechanical thump, 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 thump that did not stop. From the left, a stream of 303 rounds tore through the right flank of the charge. From the right, a second stream cut through the left. The Brens joined in, their staccato BRRP, BRRP, BRRP filling the gaps. And then 150 Australian rifles opened up on the mad minute, the men working their bolts as fast as their hands could move. The effect was not a battle, it was an annihilation. The first wave of Japanese soldiers simply ceased to exist. They were not struck. They were overwhelmed. The wall of lead and shrapnel from Australian mortars, which had also opened up, hit them with the force of a physical object. The charge collapsed, dissolving into the mud. But they were not done. A second wave, perhaps 200 strong, followed the first. Undeterred, they leaped over the remains of their comrades and charged into the same green-lit, bullet-swept zone. Keep firing! Bluey yelled, his voice raw. Feed the Vickers! Keep them firing! The gun crews worked with mechanical precision. The heavy guns bucked, steam pouring from their water jackets. The smell of cordite was so thick it was hard to breathe. The second wave met the same fate as the first. It disintegrated. A third, smaller, more desperate wave tried. They were cut down. The assault, which had begun with such terrifying momentum, lasted less than 10 minutes. But the firing continued. The Australians, now fully unleashed, poured tens of thousands of rounds into the darkness, into the churned mud where the charge had been. Then, as suddenly as it began, it was over. The Japanese were gone. The chanting had stopped. The only sound was the hammering of the rain, the hiss of the cooling machine gun barrels, and the low, stunned moans of the wounded out in the dark. Rollins lowered his rifle. His entire body felt like it was humming. Cease fire, he said, his voice a croak. Cease. Fire. Dawn at Milne Bay comes suddenly. At 05:30, the black sky turned a bruised purple, then a sickly gray. The rain finally eased to a drizzle. As the light crept over the ridge, the men of the 212th Battalion looked out upon the parlor they had defended. They were silent. Even the most hardened veterans from Syria were stunned. The clearing in front of them was a scene of utter, indescribable devastation. The ground was littered with the fallen. The Japanese attack had been not just stopped, it had been broken. Over 200 attackers lay in the mud of the kill zone. Hundreds more had been struck and had crawled away, or were still lying in the jungle fringe. Lieutenant Colonel Starr walked the line, his face grim. He stopped at Roland's pit. He didn't speak for a long time. He just looked at the field, then at the smoking Vickers guns, then at Roland's. "You said you'd shut the gate, Lieutenant," Starr said, his voice quiet. "Yes, sir." "You did," Starr said. He clapped Rowlands on the shoulder, a single hard pat. "Get your men a brew. And post sentries. They won't be back." He was right. The Japanese attack was shattered. The survivors, perhaps 600 fewer in number from the night's actions, were disorganized, terrified, and broken. The Kaigun Rikusentai, the invincible Marines, had been repulsed with catastrophic losses. The news spread down the line like wildfire. The Milko, the man who delivered rum and supplies, carried the story to the 2/9th and 2/10th. The myth was broken. The Japanese were not ghosts. They were men, and they could be stopped. The domino effect was psychological. The entire defensive posture of the Australian force changed. The fear of the dark, the terror of the Banzai Charge, was gone. A fictional but realistic after-action report might have read, "The action at KB Mission Ridge on 31 Ayug 1942, under the command of Lieutenant J. Rowlands, 212 BN, demonstrates the absolute superiority of controlled interlocking fields of fire over preemptive, harassing fire. By withholding all engagement until the enemy had fully committed to the prepared kill zone, his forces were able to inflict maximum disruption on the enemy assault, resulting in a decisive tactical victory. This doctrine of fire control as ambush is to be reviewed for immediate implementation across the brigade. The Milne Bay method was born. It wasn't an invention of steel. It was an invention of psychology, patience, and the grim application of geometry. The victory at KB Mission was the turning point. The Japanese initiative was broken. Now the Australians went on the offensive. Rowlands's tactic was immediately adopted, adapted, and refined by other units, pushing the Japanese back toward their landing beaches. Modification 1, the tin can alarm. Instead of relying on a single officer's judgment, platoons began stringing thin wires across their front, linked not to flares, but to ration cans filled with pebbles. When the alarm rattled, it wasn't a signal to fire, but a silent signal to the commander that the enemy was in the zone. The decision to fire the flare remained at the highest level. Modification 2, the mortar trap. 2-inch and 3-inch mortar teams pre-registered their tubes on the center of the designated kill zones. When the flare went up, the machine guns would fire at the edges, and the mortars would drop high explosives directly into the concentrated center, creating a perfect storm of metal. Modification 3, the hunter killer. The tactic gave the Australians supreme confidence in their defensive fire. This freed up other units, like the 2 to 12th Owls, their intelligence section, to begin aggressive offensive patrolling. They now hunted the Japanese at night, using the enemy's own infiltration tactics against them. The Japanese were stunned. Their entire doctrine of the spirit charge and night infiltration had been rendered obsolete. Their battle-winning tactic was now a fatal liability. They tried to counter. They stopped launching massed, noisy charges. They reverted to small, 4- or 5-man guerrilla attacks, trying to find gaps between the Australian companies. But the momentum was lost. The Australians, many of whom had been bogged down in static defense, were now fighting with a new, aggressive spirit. The hunters had become the hunted. The diggers, masters of desert warfare, were rapidly proving they were masters of the jungle as well. The victory was not without its costs. The most immediate and logistical cost was ammunition. In those 10 minutes of mad firing, the 212th Battalion had expended a shocking amount of ordnance. The Vickers guns alone had fired over 15,000 rounds. The Brens and rifles had fired nearly 10,000 more. Resupplying this in the Milne Bay mud, where jeeps couldn't travel and every box had to be hand-carried by exhausted men sinking to their thighs, was a logistical nightmare. A half-dozen victories like that, and they'd be out of ammunition. The Milne Bay method was devastatingly effective, but it was also horribly expensive. But the deeper cost was psychological. On the morning of September 1st, Jack Rowlands and Bluey Barnes shared a cigarette, their hands still shaking from the adrenaline come-down. They looked out at the burial details. Australian soldiers, many of them friends of the fallen Japanese from before the war, as they'd been based in Rabaul, respectfully handling the remains of the Japanese soldiers. "My old man was a farmer," Bluey said, his voice thick. "We had a rabbit plague one year. We did this." We funneled him into a wire netting yard and just went at it. Never felt right. Never felt like a fair fight. He looked at Rollins. That's what this felt like, Rowdy. Not a fight, just a job, like putting down livestock. Rollins had no answer. He had saved his men. He had won the battle. He had seen the invincible enemy broken. But the efficiency of it chilled him. The machine he had built had worked perfectly. It had turned brave men, charging with fanatical courage, into a simple equation of ballistics. The victory brought him no joy. It brought him only the cold, heavy weight of responsibility. He had proven the Japanese were not supermen. He had proven they were just men, and he had found a horribly effective way to neutralize them. This knowledge hardened him and the other men on the ridge. It was a necessary hardening, one that would be needed for the long, brutal march to Tokyo. But it left a scar. The Bushido spirit had been met by the cold, industrial logic of the digger, and the digger's logic had won. The battle for Milne Bay was over. The Japanese command, realizing their forces were shattered, their supply lines cut, and their objective unattainable, gave the order to evacuate. On the night of September 5th, Japanese cruisers and destroyers slipped back into the bay and, under cover of darkness, evacuated the survivors. They left behind over 600 of their elite, unrecoverable, in the mud of Milne Bay. Hundreds more were lost in the retreat. It was the first time, anywhere in the Second World War, that a Japanese amphibious landing force had been met on the beaches and decisively, utterly defeated on land. The news was electric. It flashed from General MacArthur's headquarters to Canberra, to Washington, to London. For a world fed on a diet of Allied defeats, it was a lifeline. A newspaper headline in Australia screamed, "Invincible? Not at Milne Bay." The impact on morale was incalculable. For the Australian soldiers fighting a desperate losing battle on the Kokoda track, the news from Milne Bay was proof that the Japanese could be beaten. Jack Rowlands was quietly awarded the Military Cross for his exceptional leadership and tactical innovation under fire. The citation mentioned his coolness in the face of a superior enemy force and his design of a defensive plan that resulted in a decisive victory. The Milne Bay method became doctrine. The lessons learned in that rain-soaked 10-minute engagement, the power of fire control, the necessity of interlocking fire, and the tactical advantage of patience, would be taught to Australian and American troops for the remainder of the Pacific War. The battle proved that the Australian digger, thought to be a desert specialist, was more than a match for the Japanese in the jungle. He was tougher, more adaptable, and, when it came down to it, more coldly pragmatic. Jack "Rowdy" Rowlands survived the war. He fought through the rest of the New Guinea campaign and later in Borneo. He returned to his cattle station in Queensland in 1946. He married, had children, and rarely, if ever, spoke of what happened at KB Mission. His children and grandchildren knew him as a quiet, thoughtful man, kind to his animals, and with an almost obsessive focus on good fences. When the summer thunderstorms would roll in, bringing torrential rain that turned his black soil fields to mud, he would sometimes stand on his porch, staring into the downpour, his hands clasped behind his back. He died in 1993. His Military Cross was in a drawer, alongside his father's medals from the Great War. Narrator voice, documentary style. The battle for KB Mission Ridge was more than just a battle. It was a psychological turning point for the entire Allied war in the Pacific. The invention that night was not a new piece of technology. It was a new idea, born from the pragmatic mind of an Australian farmer. The idea was simple: discipline. In a war against an enemy that weaponized fanaticism, Jack Rowlands and the men of the 212th Battalion weaponized patience. They held their nerve. They refused to fight the enemy's battle. Instead, they forced the enemy, for the first time, to fight theirs. By letting the Japanese charge the ridge, they were not showing weakness. They were setting a trap. The 600 casualties the Japanese suffered in that one disastrous assault were not just a military loss. It was the shattering of a myth. The first crack in the foundation of Japanese imperial conquest. The long, bloody road to victory in the Pacific began in that mud, in that rain, with a single green flare. Final scene. Queensland, Australia, 1989. An old man, Jack Rowlands, sits on his veranda. A torrential tropical storm is raging, the rain hammering his corrugated iron roof, a sound so loud it's like a memory. His granddaughter, 9 years old, runs out, afraid of the noise. "It's so loud, Grandpa," she yells over the din. Old Jack looks at her, a small, kind smile on his weathered face. He looks back out at the rain, at the dark clouds, and the flashes of lightning. "It's all right, love," he says, his voice a low, comforting rumble. "It's just noise. You just wait for it to pass. You just wait."